you. Well, I'm very, very happy to be here. I love science and non-duality, and I feel like the Science and Non-Duality Conference is a sister organization and conference to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and really want to thank Maurizio and Zaya for doing such a great job of putting this together. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about what I think the future of meditation research is in particular, but also a little bit about the politics of science and what determines what we want to study, what we can get funded to study, and how do we advance an entire field to be more inclusive of the broader range of human experience. So first I want to thank the people who have been most involved in the research that I'm going to show you today. Our funders, always very grateful to them, and a number of people that I can't list, but wonderful people, researchers across the country and around the world who have been weighing in on this idea. And of course, the Institute of Noetic Sciences has hosted this research, and if you'd like to find out more about ions, please go to our website at noetic.org. We are an organization that has been around for about 40 years. We're an independent, nonprofit research institute that explores the frontiers of consciousness and translates what we learn into applications that help people thrive in their everyday lives. And so when we look at the field of meditation research right now, it's really fascinating. We sponsored a bibliography of all of the research that had been published on meditation research in about 1996, and at the time there were about 2,000 articles. Now there are between 8,000 and 9,000 articles on the science of meditation. And if you had asked someone in 1990, would we be studying meditation at every major university in the country, they would have thought that was a really futuristic idea. So we've learned so much about how meditation affects our minds and our bodies, our brains, our genes. And I'll go over a little bit of that research. We're not going to delve deeply into it, but it's really to make the point that, number one, we know a lot about how now meditation, even practicing as little as 20 minutes a day for 8 weeks, not only changes the function of our brain, both in response to stimuli, but also at a resting state, but fascinatingly, even the structure of our brain, which I think prior to this kind of research we thought was a lot more static. It turns out we can enhance the thickness of our cortical matter, increased gray matter, all kinds of changes in our brains just through where we place our attention. Just through where we place our attention, changing the structure of our brain. We've also looked at meditation and its effects on our hormonal and biochemical systems in the brain, the stress hormones, on our immunity and how it helps us respond to intruding germs. So there's just an enormous amount of excellent research looking at, again, what really interests me is just directing your mental attention toward your breathing or toward your body for 20 minutes a day or for, maybe even over years, changes all of these psychophysiological aspects of your being. One of the most exciting areas of research is probably that not only is it affecting our brains and our bodies and our biochemicals, it may even be affecting the way our genes are expressed. We are seeing some interesting changes in gene expression as a result of meditation, and my colleague Alyssa Eppel is here, who's also been looking at the possibility that not only is it affecting gene expression, but it may be that we can use meditation to counteract some of the effects of stress on telomere shortening, which is the way that cells are told when they'll die. So the idea that we can just change our attention and it changes our body is amazing. It also changes our mind. Multiple studies now looking at different types of meditation, enhancing psychological well-being, emotion regulation, depression, anxiety, attention, concentration, cognitive flexibility. Numerous psychological variables seem to respond to meditation. And so when you look at the field of meditation research at the moment, there's a very large emphasis on how it affects our brain and our body. There's maybe next, how does it affect our mind? There's a little tiny bit on how it affects our relationships with other people and with the world around us. There's a tiny bit of research on how meditation affects what I'm calling our spirit. And what I mean by that is our sense of purpose and meaning and hope, our general orientation to the world, and even a smaller amount on how it affects sort of what you might call a collective well-being of society and the planet. So this is how we emphasize things now. I'd like to suggest in this talk that in fact, it is important what meditation does to the body, but it may be even more important what it does to the mind. If you look at what is causing the most human suffering on our planet right now, some of it is disease, but much of it, if we're looking at war, hunger, poverty, destruction of resources, these are things that actually are happening in the human mind. It may be more important for us to look at how meditation might impact the way we look at the world and then how we behave in response to what we find in it. It may even be more important how meditation affects our relationships with one another and our relationships with the environment around us and with the planet. And I'd propose it might even be even more important to look at how it instills meaning, hope, purpose, and a life orientation among all of us at our individual level and at our collective level. And yet those aspects of meditation are understudied. So it's almost like we've done this excellent job of mapping the kind of the arenas of consciousness that meditation have the potential to shed light on, but there's a much, much, much bigger terrain that we could be studying. And part of why we want to do this is we want to look at aspects of human experience that maybe not that many people have had. So you have some expert meditators, you have different types of meditation, you have longer, more intensive methods of learning meditation, and it allows people to be like these explorers that are going off into the furthest reaches of what we're capable of and coming back and telling us what they saw there. Just like in the beginning when we were starting to explore the Earth, going off and saying, you know, there's an ocean out there that lasts forever, and people are like, wow, really? So there are these ways that some explorers have been to places in consciousness that we scientists could learn from. So I want to talk about some of the areas of meditation research that I believe have been underemphasized in our science. One is embodiment. So the traditional, conventional scientific studies on meditation so far have focused almost completely on individuals above the neck, not much below the neck. Yes, hormones, yes, all of those things, but not what's happening in our bodies, in our hearts, in our gut, in our, all of these systems of the body. We're really hyper-focused on the brain and the mind. Very, very little research on the impact that meditation has on touch and movement between people. Very little research on meditation in relationship to another person, or even the impact of meditating or practicing other kinds of contemplative practices on our relationships. One of the studies that I'm involved in is looking at how pregnant women, when they meditate, this is a study I've done with John Aston, who's here in the audience, and now working closely with Alyssa Eppel. What happens when we teach pregnant women to turn their attention toward their breathing, toward their bodies? We reduce their stress level as it has done in other populations. How does that interrupt intergenerational transmission of stress, or how does it optimize the fetal environment? And we have some very enticing evidence that just by women turning their attention toward their breathing and their body for, again, about 20 minutes a day, impacts whether they have postpartum depression and maybe even impacts the health of their baby at 6 months old in comparison to women who don't get the training. Another part of meditation that is not studied very much is that we all meditate in groups. Most of us go meditate in groups at some point. Why do we do this? Why do we go and sit with 100 other people, sometimes driving 8 hours, sometimes flying to India, so we can sit in a room of other people and be silent together? Well, most people would say there's something that happens when I'm meditating in a group of other people that doesn't happen when I'm meditating by myself. And I've heard people talk about almost like a field of meditation that occurs in the room, or maybe even like when you're on a bicycle race and you're kind of catching the wind of the biker in front of you. There's some momentum that helps us that maybe even goes beyond just social reinforcement, but is a real thing in the air. There's also several experiences, and we've engaged in a study of this, on spiritual transmission, which is left out of most meditation studies right now. So this is where the majority of people traditionally who have engaged in meditation practices have had a very personal relationship with a teacher who's gone a little bit further down the road from them or is potentially even enlightened. There's an aspect of their meditation and insight practice that when they're sitting with that person, they feel is being transmitted directly from the teacher or through the teacher to them. This is an aspect of work that kind of gets eliminated from the current research on meditation. There's also a strong history of meditating, contemplating, working on these insights in sacred places. And so, how many of you have ever been to a meditation hall or a temple or an ancient structure where you know that people have done this kind of work for millennia and you felt some kind of feeling in the air when you went there, something different about that space than other places? The question is that real? Is that just imaginary because you know this? Or when you walk into it and you have that sense of something here is sacred, I can feel it in the air, there's a difference in the quality of the energy in this room. I don't think there have been more than 5 studies published on this kind of sacred space, something happening here that might facilitate our insight or our meditative process. Another area that I think has been relatively ignored in studying meditation is difficult states and stages. So far, most of the research is treating meditation sort of like it's a new form of aspirin or a new form of Prozac. And if I give you this dose of meditation, how much improvement am I going to see in your symptoms? This is true, it's helpful in a way, but it's also true that some people transform through their meditative or contemplative practice because they go through sort of a dark night of the soul and a complete falling apart and a dissolution of their ego. And, there's this mysterious deconstruction process that can take people to a very dark place. Science has a little bit of a hard time dealing with this because we want the drug to be useful. And we might call this a side effect or an adverse effect, but if any of you in the room have been through a process like this, you know that it may be something that's required for transformation through contemplative practice. So now I'm going to go a little further and say, how many of you have been sitting in meditation or contemplation and felt time move differently? In time going faster than usual, so you've been sitting there, it feels like it's 5 minutes, but it was really 2 hours. You're sitting there for 5 minutes, it feels like 2 hours. How many of you experienced what I call the long now? There is no time. Many, many, many people who sit in meditation experience this, and I guess in the conventional scientific perspective, that would be just a perceptual, imaginary thing that happens to us, illusory. But it is possible that these experiences we're having in meditation are actually telling us something about the nature of time. And so there are ways to study things like precognitive experiences or retrocausation. There are people in meditation who have these moments where they feel like they know what's going to happen, and then synchronistically it does happen. They seem to have some change in their relationship to time. I think this is really worth studying and not just sort of an anomaly, because I've heard it from so many people that they've had these experiences. So the list kind of goes on and on. Synchronicities, psychic phenomena. I was at the Mind and Life meeting this last year where a bunch of scientists meet with the Dalai Lama. One of the people who represents the spiritual tradition is Mathieu Ricard, who's been called the happiest man in the world and has been a meditation research subject because he's able to manifest complete compassion in the fMRI scanner. And they asked him, what do you think is the most important thing to study next? And he said, well, I think we should look at reincarnation and past lives. And the whole room kind of went, ah! Did he just say that? mind-matter interactions. So is it possible that not only do we, as a result of meditation, or sometimes in our meditation altered state of consciousness, have connections with other people, either in the room or even at a distance, sometimes even with our teachers? Is it also possible that somehow our minds, when we're in that state, interact with the physical world around us in a different way? And again, many people have talked about this experience of non-duality, of oneness, where the boundaries of their bodies seem to disappear. They feel like they're completely at one with everything they see around them, the chairs, the cushions, the walls, the building. This is a subjective experience, but is there any chance at all that there's something in that that is real, that in a particular state of consciousness, the permeability between me and the world around me changes so that what my consciousness does has some subtle impact on the physical world? We have laboratory experiments at the Institute of Noetic Sciences that are studying this, and if you come back for the panel at 2:35, Dean and Arno and the scientists there will be talking a little bit about how we do this. I talked about sacred places, and there's this idea of the field effect. You know, there was transcendental meditation research for a long time that looked at if there were multiple people meditating in a city, did it change the crime rate? Was there some observable difference out in the world from collectively people meditating? There were some articles that showed this. It was pretty quickly shut down because it was so contrary to what we think is possible in the conventional paradigm. But I think there is some usefulness in going back to investigating whether that has any measurable reality. And what we're really talking about in some ways is there any measurable reality to the idea that we are interconnected in ways that we don't understand yet? I think that many people engage in meditation and non-dual teachings and practices because when they do so, they have a deeply authoritative, subjective experience of not being alone in the world, but instead being completely interconnected with everything and everyone at the deepest level. And is it possible that that's true and that we can measure some of that interconnection scientifically? So why are these aspects of meditation not studied? Well, you know, it's sort of okay with us if we study this. It's a little bit less okay to study this. It's getting less okay now we're getting into the body. It's certainly not as okay to study couples meditating, and this is kind of really far off the map of science. And it's partly because there has been a historical separation between science and spirituality, or science and anything that could be conceived as too mystical for science. And it comes in large part from the time of Descartes, who basically 400 years ago said, okay, so here's how we're going to let scientists study what they need to study without the church interfering. We'll take only the natural world as scientists, and you guys be the religious people who study the inner invisible world. And that's how we're going to work this out, which was actually kind of a good thing because it allowed scientists to start doing autopsies and, you know, really looking into the natural world rather than having to rely on blind faith. So it was a good deal. But in another way, it may have been putting Descartes before Dehorse. Oh. Very bad, I know. Because what it does is it artificially separates two realms of the nature of reality, of human experience. And so now 400 years later, it was probably, as I said, a very, very good thing because it let science proceed in a way it wasn't being allowed to proceed. I think we might be mature enough now that we can actually begin to train the lens of science on the invisible world the same way we train the lens of science on the invisibility of electromagnetism, for example, which now has led to light bulbs, heat, wireless communications. At one point, looking at electromagnetic fields invisibly moving through the air and somehow being able to communicate through them and having them course through our body was just crazy. It was unthinkable. So it's possible that we now can look at the next level of the invisible world, which is our own inner world, our own consciousness. And this is why I love the logo of science and non-duality so much, that Om equals MC squared. And so when my colleagues and I talk about this out in the world and say, hey, we really think we could study these things. We're going to study reincarnation experiences. We're going to study psychic phenomena. We're going to look into these experiences of oneness. The instant critique I get from most people is, that's just a load of pseudoscience. That's their favorite word, pseudoscience. So pseudoscience means fake science using scientific language to pretend like you're studying something when you're not really. Well, most often this label is applied to research not because it has that fake science aspect of it, but because of the topic being studied. So right away, if we say we're studying psychic phenomena, stamp pseudoscience just because of the topic, even if the methods are actually completely consistent with science. So science is a process of observation, analysis, hypothesis building, hypothesis testing, and then feeding what you find back into scientific theory. I want to propose that there actually are no unscientific topics. There are unscientific methods. We can use the rigorous tools of science to study almost any topic, as long as we have the measures. Maybe Dean used this earlier. I stole this from Dean Radin. The National Society of Skeptics, I don't believe we've met. I don't believe you don't believe we've met. This is what we run into quite often. So when people get past the pseudoscience argument, the next thing is these are topics, even if they are important, they're not amenable to scientific investigation. They're impossible to study, they're invisible, they're imaginary, you just can't do it. And this is a great quote by Tesla. The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in one decade than in all the previous centuries of its existence. We can indeed study things that are currently invisible to us. In fact, the entire scientific endeavor is meant to see a clue that is an anomaly that doesn't match the current meaning system and to follow up on that clue and examine things that we can't see yet. And we innovate methods and measures to try to help us see things we can't see yet. So I reject this critique as well. The third critique is, okay, if you're going to do the science, you have to use totally different statistics because what you're proposing is so far out, we're going to move the goalposts and say, actually, you don't need a 0.05 significance level, you need a 0.15, because I don't like what you're studying. Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. I do believe that extraordinary claims require, that shifting an entire paradigm requires extraordinary evidence, but that individual studies should be held to the same level of statistical significance and peer review and funding levels as every other kind of research. So this is an example of a paper that we submitted, I think it was on precognition, to this journal, Frontiers in Neuroscience. It says, this paper has a great many merits and solves the problems that have plagued previous research in this area, and if it addressed a less controversial topic, it might well be publishable. But the data aren't strong enough to overcome doubts based on the entire enterprise of traditional Western science. So you can see how it's a little hard to jump that boundary with one study. And then there's just sort of an intensity of emotion by scientists who are very concerned that this kind of research into the further reaches of human experience might tarnish the scientific endeavor, it might contaminate it, it might introduce a mysticism and a bias that will actually damage the scientific method. And I just don't agree with this either. I think that we can study these things rigorously. I think they should be held to the exact same standards as others, not bigger standards, but the same, and that it's not actually threatening to science to investigate things that we don't know anything about. This is what science is all about. And so I think we need to be fearless in our investigation of these further realms of human experience. I think they're tremendously important to understanding our human potential, but also because these meditative experiences, the insights of non-duality, if we can search into what that is doing for people individually, it tells us something about the nature of reality in a way that possibly no other kinds of human experiences can. So if you stay for the panel in about 5 minutes or 10 minutes, we have a panel of people who have been engaged in an effort to convene meditation researchers who are, first of all, doing research in these frontier domains, but also people who are doing traditional research but are open-minded to these topics. And so we've had a meeting where we brought everyone together, we shared with them all the different kinds of research we do. We talked about why would it be important to study these kinds of domains. And so in 10 minutes, we'll be talking with Alyssa Eppel, Shauna Shapiro, Dean Radin, and Arnaud Delorme about why would it be important to do these things, how are we doing them, and how might we advance the field and expand it so that it would be more inclusive of the full range of our experiences. Thank you. Okay, so I think we have 5 minutes for questions or comments.
Okay, just to make my life a little more efficient, is there somewhere that is listing all of the most recent research so I don't have to go and check all the journals myself?
Well, there is. At the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we have a meditation bibliography that stays relatively updated in terms of all of the 8,000 or so studies that have been done on meditation that you can search. So that's at noetic.org. And in terms of the more frontier kinds of research I was talking about, noetic.org is also a good research. Also, deanradin.com, he keeps a pretty good list of the studies on precognition and retrocausation and psi phenomena. So those are 2 places you can go.
That makes my life so much easier.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
What are the current sources of funding for this kind of research? Like, where are you, and where are a lot of these researchers getting the means to do this?
Well, there
I have a personal
are
interest in this.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of meditation research in general, increasingly NIH is funding meditation research, Department of Defense, there are big grants going to meditation research, and this is great. In terms of the frontier aspects of meditation research, it's primarily visionary individuals who believe that this is extremely important. Just like every major advancement in science, basically it's patrons who come in and say, okay, I had this experience, I want someone to study it, and I'm going to pay for it. And then some foundations like the ones I mentioned earlier, the Fetzer Memorial Trust. There's a Portuguese foundation called the Be All Foundation that has funded much of our work in this arena. They're a drug company, and they have a foundation, and they're interested in this kind of work. The Templeton Foundation has done some, and the David Lynch Foundation, the filmmaker. So, also, I would say if you become a member of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, it's not very much money, and it's a little bit like National Geographic. So if you give $40 or $120, you get a lot of information, and it supports the research moving forward. Yeah.
So it seems like, as you've shown very clearly and Dean has shown, mainstream science is in many ways really confined by its belief system, and that's a really easy and common thing to fall into. I wonder, just out of curiosity, if you were to take a sort of a meta look at ions and people doing similar research, can you notice what constraints you guys have? Mm-hmm. And are there certain research topics that you consider too fringe or too weird to look at?
Yeah. Well, science moves forward through the interests, primarily through the interests of individual investigators who have some idea or they have some curiosity, and they're obsessed with following that curiosity, which is how I choose my research topics, and Dean and everyone else. And so in that way, I think science is limited by topics that nobody's interested in. I'm not sure I believe, other than a topic that would somehow require research that harms someone, that I think there's any topics that should be off limits if somebody's truly interested in it at the level of obsession that good research requires. But, personally, I don't personally study crop circles or Bigfoot, or, there's some things that it's not because I think no one should. I just think, I just don't have an interest in it. I don't see the relevance. So some people feel that way about the stuff we study. I don't see the relevance. I don't see why. So I think does that answer your question?
Relevance. This is a pretty big topic because when it was relevant for the Cold War to have remote viewing, they put a lot of money in the research. So it's a double-edged sword because, Einstein said famously, if I would have to live my life over again, I'd become a plumber, because he was appalled with what happened as a result of his investigation. So what's your idea about that?
I'm not sure. I think it's a good comment, what you're saying. I certainly think that part of what drives my desire to look into experiences of interconnectedness is that I've now studied thousands of people who have an experience, whether in contemplative practice or in nature or in a relationship, where even just for a moment they feel that they are interconnected with all other people on the planet or even all other beings. And after that moment, they orient their lives around service and altruism and doing good things in the world. So I think that's a pretty important thing to look at. If that's motivating the kind of behavior we need to see in people, we should find out every single thing we can about what is that experience and why is it happening.